The amount of VRAM in your graphics card didn't used to matter all that much, but with every new game that gets released, it seems like they all want the ultra realistic graphics, so it just makes it harder to run every time. So it seems like you need a minimum of 8 GB of VRAM, and even that is kind of low in today's standards. But what if you have a graphics card with only 4 GB of VRAM and it's about 7 years old? Will you still be able to play any games? And if so, how does it perform? Well, that's what I'm going to find out. I have this AMD RX 580 and it's got 4 GB of GDDR5 video memory. This series of graphics cards from AMD has really held up over time, and it's been in the spotlight numerous of times when it comes to budget hardware, and for some, it may still be enough. If you wanted to pick one up today in 2024, you can buy them all day on eBay for around 50 bucks. Or if you wanted the stronger 8 GB version, that one's around $75. I paid $25 for mine in a Facebook Marketplace deal, which is pretty good. The exact model I have is from Sapphire, has a cool blue LED, and requires one 6-pin power cable and one 8-pin power cable. The computer I'm using to test it in, it's rocking an i5-12400F, 16 GB of DDR4 clocked at 3200 MHz, and the games are installed on an MSI Spatium M470 SSD. It's not a super powerful system, but it's just enough to make sure the RX 580 performs at its best. I'm going to test it with a few esports titles, which are easier to run, and then I'll throw some harder games at it like Cyberpunk and Helldivers 2. Before doing the testing, I took it apart and applied some fresh thermal paste. Now, one of the thermal pads did tear, but they were still in good shape, so I left it as is since I didn't even have any replacements available. But as you'll see in the benchmarks, this GPU maintained great temperatures throughout. The first test I did was a time spy. It's just a synthetic benchmark, and I just run it to get a rough idea of performance. I got a total score of 4,592 and a graphics score of 4,209. Now for the games. We're first gonna test it against Cyberpunk, and I just wanna show you the raw performance of this graphics card. And overall, I was really surprised that it held its own pretty well. I ran it 2 times. The first time was at 1080p with the high settings preset. I just ran the built-in benchmark and we averaged 42 FPS with a 1% low of 32. Game looks pretty good with high settings, and it was plenty smooth with that 1% low. Now I wanted to see if we could get above 60 FPS, so I ran it at 1080p with high settings. The only change I made was I enabled frame generation, and with that we saw a pretty huge boost with an average of 73, and the 1% low went up all the way to 58. Like I said, I was pretty surprised with Cyberpunk. Next up, for an easier to run game, I ran some Valorant. This is really good, especially for higher refresh rates. I'm not the best at the game, but I am getting a little bit better. I ran it at 1080p with all high settings, and we saw an average FPS of 202 with a 1% low of 154. With this one, I would just recommend you have a strong enough CPU so you make sure you get the full performance, because this game, it is more CPU dependent since you're having to render more frames. But yeah, this was really smooth. Even the 1% low would be perfect for 144 Hz refresh rate. Now for another easier to run game, I tested some Apex Legends. It was honestly a great experience. Apex is pretty optimized and runs pretty well on older hardware now. I tested it at 1080p with TSAA on and all high settings with max FOV. Hopped into their gun run mode and we averaged 106 FPS with a 1% low of 81. Now for Call of Duty Warzone, this is about a medium to run game, but for this, it's honestly pretty hard, and we finally get a game where the amount of VRAM is definitely holding us back. I first tried testing at native 1080p with AMD FSR 3.0, and all the graphics settings were set to high. With those settings, we were above our VRAM limit and under 60 FPS. So I went through and lowered all the settings from high to low or normal. I still kept everything the same, native 1080p, AMD FSR 3.0, but man, we were still under 60 FPS with an average of 57, 1% low of 41. Now it was smooth, you know, the 1% low wasn't too lower than the average, but if you wanted a more enjoyable experience in this game, I would recommend a GPU with at least 8 GB of VRAM. And as I mentioned earlier, the 8 GB version of this GPU is around $75, and with that one, you will average around 70 FPS with ultra settings. The thing holding us back is the VRAM. Now for another harder to run game, I loaded into the First Descendant. It's a newly released game, and honestly, it's pretty fun with its shorter mission times. Now the first thing it told me was the gameplay might be unstable due to the spec requirements, and upon loading in, we were on all low settings, but the game looked surprisingly great. but we were still under 60 FPS. Luckily they have AMD frame generation. I turned that on and it instantly boosted our FPS to above 60, and overall it made it a way more enjoyable experience. We averaged 78 FPS with a 1% low of 62. Next up in Helldivers 2, this is another game where 4 GB of VRAM is not enough, kind of like Warzone. But I will say I'm still pretty impressed with it. I played at 1080p with the high graphics preset. Now yes, we were under 60 FPS, but I was impressed with how smooth the game was despite being under that 60 FPS. We averaged 39 with a 1% low of 33. I then tried messing with the render quality. I dropped it to performance, and honestly I didn't even see that much of a difference in the FPS, but I did notice a drop in the graphic quality. I'd rather play at high settings and still have a smooth experience. Now in Fortnite, I of course have to test Fortnite. This can be an easier to run game, but it also can be pretty demanding, especially with the higher graphic settings. Like I said in the intro, everyone wants to have super realistic graphics. I don't know why. Anyways, I first tried testing it at 1080p with DirectX 12, and I had used the high settings preset. Now it was playable, but we were only getting around 30 FPS, and for Fortnite, I would argue you want at least 60 FPS for a smoother experience. I then dropped the settings from high to medium, and with that, we were finally averaging a decent FPS with 63, and 1% low was 47. If you want more performance, I would recommend you either switch the rendering mode from DirectX 12 to performance mode, or just use pro settings, which I used here at the end. It's far view distance, everything else on low, and 100% 3D red scale. With that, I saw an average FPS of 71. Like I said, above 60 is great, and as long as it's a smooth experience, then it will be more than playable. I would recommend cap at 60 or somewhere around there, and it will be buttery smooth. Now in GTA 5, this is an easier to run game, considering, it's been out forever. Hopefully GTA 6 will run decently on older hardware. Anyways, I played at 1080p with all high settings, and I was just having fun being a menace. I mean, what else would you do in GTA 5? I averaged 110 FPS with a 1% low of 95. Honestly, I'm quite impressed with the results we got from this GPU. Now you have to keep in mind, this thing is about 7 years old and it only has 4 GB of VRAM, so the fact it's holding up is awesome. In my opinion, it's a great option if you're looking to game on a budget, since it can be had for around 50 bucks and it can play a good amount of games. Now, a lot of the games will go over that VRAM limit like we saw in Warzone, and for that, it is so nice when the games support frame generation. For example, in Cyberpunk, we went from an average of 42 FPS all the way to 73 with a simple change in the settings. Now, in some games like Helldivers 2, they don't have AMD frame generation, but it's still playable. At least I would say Helldivers was playable. It was pretty smooth. Anyways, leave your thoughts on this GPU down below and share what GPU you're using right now, or maybe what your first graphics card was. My first GPU was a GTX 1060 with 6 GB of VRAM. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and smash the like button, subscribe if you loved it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.